Hey everyone, Stefan Norgaard here, PhD student in urban planning at Columbia University's graduate program in architecture planning and preservation. And I'm here at the 10th International Conference on Food Studies, gone virtual, and presenting with my colleague and collaborator, Mariel Collard. Our research is titled Trading on Terroir, Fostering Artisanal Cheese and Alcohol Production Through Specialized Agrarian Industrial Districts, or SEDS. And wish I could be with all of you in person, but this is the next best thing, and looking forward to hearing all of your presentations and research as well. So for myself and Mariel, our point of departure here are industrial districts, which have a long history in the literature going back all the way to Alfred Marshall's Marshallian clusters in the 1880s in Europe and the United Kingdom. And more recently, with the kind of transitions that Peoria and Sable note from Fordist Keynesian mass production to more specialty industrial dualism that involved what scholars like David Harvey might call flexible accumulation or flexible specialization. And the basic idea here is that as large-scale mass production broke down, there were new approaches that involved agglomerations at the level of the economic region, knowledge sharing, and technology. And so this is a story that we've heard a lot before in the kind of urban economic development literature. But we're thinking about this not necessarily with the ways the textile industry in India went from large-scale monolithic mass production to small-scale piece rate and more precarious labor in the 1980s and 1990s. Or we're not thinking about it in changes in footwear production in Mexico. We're thinking actually about specialized agrarian industrial districts. And so what we mean by these concepts, or SEDS, are bounded region-specific zones that are producing specialized agricultural products. And as such, SEDS are vertically disintegrated, meaning that localized products and producers networks actually enable higher end products and sales, often for export rather than local consumption. And these SEDS actually supplant international divisions of capital and labor and the associated outcomes of mass production or cheap food, and instead create distinctive locally produced commodities available for export the world over. This is a conceptual diagram of SEDS. And you can see here that there are a set of features typical to their formation. We engaged literature on regionalism and regional agglomeration, the cooperative competition necessary for different firms that are co-located in a small regional space to work together, the world historical transformations from the mass production paradigm to the agglomerative region paradigm, work on global supply chains, value chains, and logistics, and broader literature on processes of depeasantization and associated urbanization. We created an atlas, an archive of SEDS the world over, looking at everything from cereals in Ethiopia to different huckleberries in Saskatchewan, Canada, to Sichuan peppers in China. But we ultimately settled on 4 specific geographies and 2 commodities, wine and cheese, broadly defined, that will bound our inquiry empirically. And so we're interested in wine and cheese specifically because these commodities have distinctive material and biophysical properties that lend themselves to the political and institutional construction of SEDS. Namely, wine and cheese both involve craft or guild traditions, and they also are associated with consumption brands or tastes that often go to a global metropolitan consumer on the other end. And so with mezcal and Zapotitlan de Vadillo in Jalisco, Mexico, with queijo carastra, a specific type of artisanal cheese in Minas Gerais, Brazil, with fromage comté in the Franche-Comté of France, and with Stellenbosch wine in the Cape Winelands, we see these features at work that utilize a lot of the cooperative competition and supply networks in play. Here are some images of those commodities in formation. And so through this empirical investigation, we ultimately find that SEDs have a set of distinctive features. And we'd like to both highlight these in our research and then also critically interrogate them. So first, SEDs have specific regulatory and institutional arrangements. It means that local or national state boundaries designate SEDs. There's both an inside and an outside. And denominations of origin demarcate which products can be considered within these SEDs. That allows producers to develop and exchange localized knowledges and specific standards or regulations of production. And these are different than the demands imposed by multilateral or international transnational corporations, TNCs. Additionally, this means that there's a set of exclusions that can also involve regional or economic nationalism as producers try to privilege a certain geography of insiders over outsiders. Two, SEDs are typically associated with distinctive landed property regimes. They're associated with recombinant areas of agrarian reform movements like the ejidos in the context of Mexico, or collective land ownership struggles in the context of South Africa. And there's also a lot of protection, cultural or natural heritage zones associated with SEDs, for example, in the context of France. And third, terroir. There is a social construction of taste or desire with SEDs and the products or commodities they produce that are specifically tied to the biophysical properties of the land on which these products come from which these products come. And as such, there is a cultural capital that is distinctively territorial in nature and that shapes consumer demand. And so these material properties of the commodities allow for taste shaping in consumer markets and further allow SEDs to achieve upmarket success when compared with the kind of race to the bottom globalization that characterizes cheap food of transnational corporations. So we'll quickly delve into each of these three features in a little bit more depth. And then also provide some of the downsides or undersides or exclusions of SEDs that exist. So with regard to the regulatory and institutional arrangements that demarcate SEDs, these arrangements are a product of a specific world historical context and also a political economic regime. And in the context of the SEDs we studied, the 4 SEDs we studied across the world, we see a context of late liberalization and specific free trade policies and product export policies that enable SEDs to be competitive for export. But we also see the new rise of the agglomerative cluster, what someone like Ed Glazer might call the agglomeration effect. And you see this with folks like Michael Porter, who researches the California wine cluster and the ability of different firms located together in a region to share knowledge, to share infrastructural networks, and more. And also we see new state regulations, like the denominations of origins, that protect smallholder agriculture in some cases. This is certainly the case in France with their wine and cheese industry. Here are some examples of denomination of origin labels. These actually bound which products can be considered the authentic SED type of product. So if you want to have Franche-Comté cheese, it'll need to have that sticker on it. If you want to have your product be called mezcal, it needs to have an official denomination of origin sticker on it. And the region limits where products can be called and where they cannot be called by that particular name. Certainly it needs to be from Champagne in France to be champagne. And you cannot have mezcal in Jalisco, only in Oaxaca and other regions. And so this creates, for certain reasons, a set of exclusions. Here we have, on the left, we have France, we have Franche-Comté in the center, and we have the town of Poligny, which is a real center of marketing in the Franche-Comté for Comté cheese. And in addition to the broader institutional regulations that demarcate SEDs, we see other regulations here, like the fact that there must be 1 hectare per cow, and that only Montbéliard cows are permitted for the cheese to be considered Comté cheese. And so here we see additional regulatory mechanisms that make this product more exclusive, but also that bound it to a specific terroir, because Montbéliard cows do not grow everywhere. They exist in a specific terrain as well. And there are, of course, some spatial or territorial requirements for Comté cheese that limit the number of producers. In the context of queijo canastra, so here we are now in Minas Gerais, Brazil, we see once again denomination of origin logos, and we see once again that there are specific territories that are associated with specific types of queijo Minas that are also bounded in place. And incidentally, we see a correlation spatially here between high salary landowners and concentrations of agricultural movements and agricultural groups, as seen there on the left. And if you look in the kind of south central part of Brazil, this is Minas Gerais, you see this high correlation of high salary landowners and agricultural resistance movements, also in an area that voted highly for President Bolsonaro in the last election. So we might ask, why is this? Well, SEDS and their agricultural regulatory regimes foster both economic and regional protectionism and nationalism, as these small producers want to make sure they still have the benefit of state protections as it relates to a global free market. And so this is one of the undersides associated with these institutional arrangements, are that SEDS can, in their nature and construction, promote regional and economic nationalism that goes along with cultural nationalism and politics of exclusion. Here we see an interesting feature in that even though SEDS are associated with terroir that are regionally bounded, there is an international exchange between the École Nationale d'Industrie Laitière, the international cheese cultivation school in Poligny, France, and in Brazil. And so there's an international exchange with sharing these very intimate and craft production practices with high-end cheeses that extends across these different sets. So our second feature that relates to the distinctive nature of SEDS and their undersides are landed property regimes. Taking a look at the case of Mexico here, we see that there's extensive internal and seasonal migrations that relate to the mezcal and agave production in places like Jalisco and Oaxaca. And that this internal migration is as much domestic as it is international. We also see that there is a set of spatial legacies that involve here cities and towns, here agricultural lands, and here ejidos, or collectively shared lands that were broken up after the Mexican Revolution and distributed to former peasant groups. And we see a striking correlation between these collective or customary land regimes and regimes that produce mezcal in places like Jalisco. So with that correlation noted, and with these towns in mind, we see that mezcal production is often very localized and very much tied to the land. And there's specific types of agave plants and specific types of production practices that can only really take place in hyperlocal geographies. And we also see here that there's a specific denomination of origin that's associated with mezcal from different regions. And that this denomination of origin once again excludes what can and cannot be considered mezcal. Here we have the case of South Africa, where once again, seasonal and domestic migration is very much essential to the industrial production of wine in the Cape Winelands. So from former Bantustans, shown in color on the right-hand side of the map, we see that there's a lot of migration to the greater Cape Town area for labor and work, often unregulated and unprotected in the wine industry. This is one particular homeland, Huaqua, which is Sotho speaking. And from Huaqua to the Cape Winelands, there's a large amount of domestic migration. Now, many of the townships in this part of the Western Cape, near Cape Town, are Xhosa speaking and not Sotho speaking. But we see that there are distinctive domestic labor migration patterns that emerge because of the demand for informal workers in the winelands. And you can also see tremendous population density here relative to the rest of Stellenbosch and other zones, simply because you have a large amount of informal settlements of agricultural workers who come to work in these industries. And that population density certainly, when compared with a wine farm there on the right is very, very easy to see. And so a downside of the distinctive landed property regimes that designate SEDS is that these property regimes are often now associated with fewer labor protections and more precarious labor, especially since these industries, even though they produce high income and specialty products, they still rely on exploited or underregulated labor. So third and finally, we engage terroir and the specific agroforestry and biophysical practices inherent to the production of SEDS. One thing to note about terroir is that with products like mezcal and wine and cheese, there are very distinctive and intensive production practices that are grounded in a local geography. We see this here with the production practice for mezcal in Zapotitlan and Jalisco. It's an extensive production practice, and a lot of the processes involve local tools and local ingredients that can only be found in the region. The same is the case in the Franche-Comté, and there's also a lot of capital investment that requires productive and storage and other processes like pasteurization and standardizing. And so this production practice, in addition to being honed over centuries by the local producers, is local to a specific region, whether it's temperature, whether it's soil, or other features. And so because part of the appeal of SEDS is their sustainable local harvest, and that they're differentiated from mass production very distinctively, this is what's the terroir is being traded on in a sense for the firm's productive value, as is the history, the technique, the skill inherent to these production processes, and we see that here in these photos. But nonetheless, the yearly production, not just in this case as a figure for mezcal, but for all of these commodities, has been increasing rapidly as there's a higher consumer demand recently for local products that are sustainably made and not subject to the race to the bottom, globalization, and cheap food. And so this leads to a challenging process. Number one, and it's an underside, is that a lot of this production is for export and not for local consumption. So you oftentimes have products produced locally that go to export but aren't available in these very local geographies. And also you deal with a situation where other transnational corporations may masquerade their products as SEDS, but not necessarily have the same local terroir or productive processes. Here we see a map of the global metropolitan network, the consumers of these higher end SED products. And we also see how these geographies are branded very distinctively for tourism and leisure. So the Franche-Comté, in addition to being a site of active agro-industry and production, is also a site of tourism and leisure. It's another part of this region and this space marketing itself for an international, global metropolitan audience. So with all of these challenges to SEDS, these undersides, we'd like to close by providing an alternative theoretical and epistemic contribution to the literature of what SEDS could look like to be more sustainable, equitable, and just agro-industry models. First, we would hope that production networks continue to share knowledge through cooperative competition, but involve agricultural and industrial inputs from local small and medium-sized firms rather than transnational corporations. We hope that these firms are for local consumption as much as they are for export, and that they're available locally, and that they engage with supply chains that have similar practices. And we also hope that state support and history grounds local labor practices and make sure that there are quality standards while also ensuring the viability of the firm. Land, which is always essential to the craft or specialized nature of SEDS, ought to be shared and owned with a regime that is equitable. And we want to make sure that the outputs to SEDS are also local SMEs and not necessarily transnational corporations. So this basic needs developmentalism there on the figure shows that a portion of the surplus generated from SEDS that normally goes to export and profit should be regenerated back into the local community, such that there's a virtuous cycle of social reproduction, and that these geographies can continue to sustain themselves and their workforce long into the future. So that's our contribution on sets. We hope that you enjoyed the presentation. And for myself and Mariel, please post any comments underneath the presentation on this page of the website. Thank you so much for listening, and we look forward to a lively conversation online.